Dale Mackie has acquired quite a reputation in the field of moral philosophy as the originator of a type of moral theory called error theory. This type of theory says that all moral claims are false. They're like claims about ghosts or phlogiston, or like God from the point of view of an atheist. I believe that the conventional interpretation of Mackie is seriously flawed. Instead, I interpret Mackie as saying that all moral facts were like statements about atoms in the 19th century. All claims about atoms were mistaken at the time. This is because all claims about atoms said that the smallest piece of any element didn't have any parts. But they did have parts, so all of those claims were false. But it was an easy problem to fix. They dropped indivisible particle from the meaning of the term atom and carried on with business as usual, or very near to business as usual, without the error. In the case of atoms, scientists needed to drop the claim that atoms didn't have any parts from the meaning of the term atoms, and the problem was fixed. Atoms were still the smallest piece of an element. If we went smaller than an atom, we had electrons, neutrons, and protons. We didn't have still smaller bits of hydrogen, sulfur, or gold, but we could go smaller. Now, in the case of morality, what we have to do, according to Mackie, is simply drop objective intrinsic prescriptivity from the meaning of moral terms. Even without this concept of objective intrinsic prescriptivity, we could talk about the value of things. We could talk about the value they have in terms of having the property of being, as Mackie said, such as to fulfill the desires in question. These things exist, and these things actually do guide real-world action. The aversion to pain, the taste of an apple, the sight of a sunrise, these things all have value. And these things all have value in virtue of the fact that they have the capacity of being such as to fulfill the desires in question. When it comes to evaluating rules, concepts of rights and duties, or dispositions, we can judge whether they are or are not such as to fulfill all desires, regardless of whose they are. This type of value is real. It exists. And it is so much like moral value that it's difficult to tell the difference. So it's so difficult to tell the difference that for 50 years, Mackie scholars have failed to notice that there was a difference. So my interpretation of Mackie's view is not the conventional interpretation. When I assess Mackie's theory, I assess the theory that I think Mackie proposed, not the conventional interpretation of Mackie. So what did Mackie get right? One of the things that Mackie got right is that there is no such thing as objective intrinsic prescriptivity. There's no value built directly into things. What makes me say that? Well, I see no evidence for it. In this, objective intrinsic prescriptivity is like ghosts and unicorns and Santa Claus and the like. Who knows? Maybe they exist, but there's no evidence for them. More to the point, objective intrinsic prescriptivity isn't needed to explain why somebody kept a promise or repaid a debt or donated to charity. Beliefs about objective intrinsic prescriptivity may be a part of the explanation in some cases. However, this is like the way somebody's belief about ghosts can prevent them from buying a house they believe is haunted. Beliefs can influence action, but beliefs don't make things real. A great deal of the value that we do experience has to do with things having those properties that fulfill or thwart our desires. I don't need to postulate objective intrinsic prescriptivity to explain why I have such an aversion to pain. I can explain that aversion just fine in terms of a system that sends signals to a brain that then reacts with a felt urgency to make it stop. That system exists as a result of random mutations in far distant ancestors. Those mutations kept those ancestors alive and producing offspring, and those offspring had the same aversion, and I inherited from them. But pain is very real, and recognizing the fact that it is a biological reaction to certain sensations doesn't stop it from hurting. Real value exists as relationships between objects of evaluation and desires. It exists as objects of evaluation being such as to fulfill the desires in question. Moral value, if moral value is to be real, has to be some sort of relationship between objects of evaluation and desires. It has to be that relationship that best fits our moral practices. Mackie thinks that the relationship that does this is the relationship between rules, rights, duties, and dispositions on the one side, and all desires, regardless of whose they are, on the other. And this brings me to one of the things that I think Mackie got wrong. While it's true that Mackie needs to find a real relationship between objects of evaluation and desires that fits our moral practice as closely as possible, the relationship he picks falls a bit short. As mentioned, this is a relationship between rules, rights, duties, and dispositions, and all desires regardless of whose they are. In contrast, I hold that the relationship that best accounts for moral practices is the relationship between malleable desires, which are those desires that praise and condemnation can help to shape and mold and alter, and other desires, regardless of whose they are. Those other desires provide other people with the reasons to promote a desire through praise or condemnation. This is a bit complex, and I don't have the space to defend it here. I hope to discuss the details in other videos. Quite briefly, I defend this account on the grounds that to alter another person's behavior, one has to alter the psychological states that are responsible for that behavior. And praise and condemnation have the power to do this. By using praise and condemnation, we can promote certain values within a community. Then it makes sense to ask, which traits or dispositions does it make sense to praise, and which does it make sense to condemn? That which people generally have reasons to promote throughout a community, in everybody, is that which they have reasons to praise. And that which it makes sense to react to with condemnation is considered blameworthy. Another mistake that I think Mackie made rests in his assertion that moral claims make a claim about objective intrinsic prescriptivity that is built into the very meaning of the words. I'm not going to deny that false claims about objective intrinsic prescriptivity infect our moral discussions, but in spite of these frequent errors, the claim is not a part of the meaning of moral terms. Thousands of years of moralizing have gotten us into the practice of using moral praise and condemnation to promote useful desires and aversions, and to argue for and against moral positions on the grounds of which dispositions to promote through moral praise and condemnation. For this reason, correcting the error of objective intrinsic prescriptivity involves relatively insignificant changes in our moral practices. I will create future videos in which I defend these two claims, but for current purposes, it's sufficient to focus on what I think Mackie gets right. There is no objective intrinsic prescriptivity. There is an objectivity of values that relates objects of evaluation to desires. Moral values, if they are to be real, must be some kind of relationship between objects of evaluation and desires. It has to be that relationship that best fits our moral practices. For the most part, I think that Mackie's book, Ethics: Inventing Right and Wrong, is extremely accurate if it's interpreted correctly. The current interpretation of Mackie misses that target by a good measure. But the fault is not in Mackie's theory. The fault is in those interpretations.